To summarise about sociobiology part 1, before we have a look at some of the criticisms that were raised about it, it attempts to become a theory of everything. It attempts to explain all aspects of human behaviour and human nature in terms of our evolutionary inheritance. It claims to be a theory of everything. Wilson also made the claim, which upset an enormous amount of people, that you didn't need history or anthropology or sociology or philosophy or English literature or any of these other humanities and social science disciplines. If you practiced sociobiology, that is all that you would need to explain human society and human culture. We would need nothing else. And of course, actually, if you go and have a look at the works of people like Joseph Carroll, you will see that they put forward the idea that all you need to explain the works of Jane Austen or William Shakespeare or whoever is a knowledge of sociobiology, or at least a knowledge of evolutionary theory. Sociobiology and its variants could quite literally explain everything. All of those things. Ethics, morality, nationalism, religion, conformity, territoriality, sexual practice, male dominance and the woman's role in the home, IQ, genocide, comedy. The list goes on and on and on and on. These were all things that sociobiology, with its Darwinian impulse, could explain. And as I've indicated, E.O. Wilson believed in his initial work that the humanities would just wither away because you wouldn't need it anymore. All you'd really need to do is to be able to explain ant sociology or elephant sociology and extend that to the realms of the human kingdom. It may not be too much to say that sociology and the other social sciences, as well as the humanities, are the last branches of biology waiting to be included in the modern synthesis. Sooner or later, political science, law, economics, psychology, psychiatry, and anthropology will all be branches of sociobiology. You can imagine how well this went down with scholars in all of these disciplines, particularly as we were in a period where the relationship between genetic inheritance, behaviour, and how we acted in the world had become a really hot political issue. And what we were going to see during the 1970s, and what we'll just have a quick look at here, was a battle between those individuals that believed that older idea about the blank slate, about cultural and social determinism, over those that believe in biological determinism. The opposition to sociobiology. During the late 60s and early 70s, an organisation called the Scientists and Engineers for Political Action emerged out of the anti-Vietnam movement, and also as part and parcel of the politics of the New Left that was challenging the established order, that was part and parcel of that whole 1960s upsurge against old authority. They promoted notions like science for the people, and the important moving members of the group were individuals like Richard Lewontin, the evolutionary biologist, who, as we'll see, was also a Marxist and was also a critic of sociobiology. Another figure that was involved in this movement was Stephen Jay Gould, who took a great deal of umbrage to the political, social and cultural implications of sociobiology. This was, in effect, a left-wing resistance to the notions of sociobiology that was being driven by biologists, and in Gould's case, paleontologists, and people that tended to fall on the left. Other individuals would be Lynn Margulis. And Wilson was completely and utterly perplexed by this resistance, which I think, tells us quite a lot about him. You've got to imagine it like this. On this floor here, Richard Lewontin is working on his particular area of evolutionary biology. Committed Marxist, organising action groups to fight the power, promote science for the people, promote Marxism through science. On the upper floor is the liberal Edward Wilson, who's just published Sociobiology, thinks he's come up with a great idea and claims to be completely and utterly politically unaware of the implications of his theory. I don't know if they had water coolers at the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Harvard, or where they went to share their coffees or whatever. But I'm sure that if Wilson bumped into Levontin, there was probably a great deal of tension. Because Levontin, sitting in his, I don't know if that's his office, we'll just imagine it is, had written this piece that basically put the boot in big time into sociobiology, which he described as a genetic justification of the status quo and of existing privileges for certain groups according to class, race or sex. Historically powerful countries or ruling groups within them have drawn support for the maintenance or extension of their power from these products of the scientific community. For Levontin, sociobiology is just an extension of the old eugenics program in the sense that it argues a very similar premise. It opens the door to the idea that a particular race has the right to perfect itself and rule over the others, or opens the door to a class explanation that is going to maintain the best and the brightest always going to be members of the elite, the dominant class, and they have a biological right to dominate the rest of us. This was what Levontin saw in it, and he saw it as an extension of Nazi Germany. Sitting up on the top floor, or on the second floor or whatever, poor old Wilson was a bit perplexed. I'd been blindsided by the attack. He didn't see it coming. Having expected some frontal fire from social scientists on primary evidential grounds, I'd received instead a political enfilade from the flank. In 1975, I was a political naive. I knew almost nothing about Marxism as either a political belief or a mode of analysis. I paid little attention to the dynamism of the activist left, and I'd never heard of science for the people. I was not an intellectual in the European, New York or Cambridge sense. It seems remarkable to think that even an entomologist could have been hiding under rocks studying ants while the Cold War unfolded, while the threat of nuclear annihilation was going on, where the draft was resisted by millions of people on the streets, where terrorism and resistance had been brought to both Europe and to the USA in the name of trying to fight the power. It seems strange to believe that he could have been so short-sighted that he had no understanding of the deep and long history of the relationship between what happens when Darwinism is used in an applied form to society. It was an extraordinary statement. The CESPA, as I think we'll call them, were extremely active during the 70s and 80s, campaigning against the introduction of genetic engineering. It accused sociobiology of being politics masquerading as impartial science, which provides the ideological underpinnings for the maintenance of current power relationships. But there were others beyond that who were really concerned about the determinism that was inherent in sociobiology. In particular, what it did to conceptions of free will. That basically, if you adhere to a strict model of sociobiology, then your freedom to act is seriously curtailed. Free will becomes something of a fantasy that we might talk about, but we're always going to be like those puppets on the front of Time magazine. And yeah, it goes on and on and on and on until we end up here. I have to apologise for putting a skinhead up on there. When I was growing up, the skinhead movement had kind of come back in big force, and they were predominantly associated with the right, it has to be said, and I'll say this on behalf of left-wing skinheads everywhere, because there were quite a lot of them, that not all skinheads are racists. Some of them actually fight racism. Some of them are Marxists. Some of them have formed extremely loud and unpleasant bands to campaign against the racist element of the skinhead movement. Nevertheless, it is a stereotype that holds more true than less true. And this is a quote that was lifted from a book written in the early 1980s from a guy that had gone around interviewing people, like skinheads, and asking them what they thought about the relationship of biology and power. And this was one of the quotes that they came came up with, of a far greater significance is the basic instinct common to all species to identify only with one's like group, to inbreed and to shun outbreeding. In human society, this instinct is racial, and it, above all else, operates to ensure genetic survival. Of course, we can never be responsible wholly for the ideas that we put forward. We've seen, again, I've said, applied Darwinism can often be extremely dangerous. Now, Darwinism applied in a eugenic context has caused untold misery and has usually been done so on the flimsiest of bases. We had to be very careful about taking a biological theory like evolution through natural selection and thinking that we can develop politics out of it. And of course, none of it is Darwin's fault. He was just trying to do what he did, develop an effective theory that explained how speciation occurred, explain the natural world. But then even Darwin couldn't help thinking about the application of his theory, thinking about the relationship between evolution by natural selection and race and imperialism and gender. The temptation is always going to be there. And of course, Darwin can't be held culpable for what people like Nazi Germans during the 1920s and 1930s. He can't be held culpable for the thought of Nietzsche and how that impacted upon the way that people conceived of these things. Wilson, how responsible can he be held for the fact that his doctrine can be taken by far-right groups and used to argue for violent forms of racism and exclusion?